Thank you so much for joining us for ESG Talk, wherever you may be around the world. I'm going to open up with a quote from today's guest. Bhushan Sethi noted that the role of employers is not to tell workers what to think, but to give them voice, choice, and a safe environment to share feelings, listening, and learning about how to tackle these issues that are impacting their colleagues. So please join me in welcoming him to the show.
So great to see you again, Mandy. Looking forward to this.
To help us think about you and get to know you a little bit more, our conversation starter today is I've watched you walk executives through tackling complex issues around human capital. Where did this come from? Your love of complex problems and helping companies simplify it?
Mandy, ever since I've been a child, I've been innately curious. If my parents were alive today, they would kind of echo that. I've always been interested in global topics. My grandfather was a diplomat and used to tell us stories about traveling around the world and living around the world. And here I am, a number of years later and helping global companies and have lived in many different countries. I've lived in the US now for 21, but I just love I love addressing new problems. And the pandemic was a new set of business and societal problems for all of us in our homes and in our workplaces. It's just the latest. We're going to have many more, I'm afraid to say. And so I just think that those skills of curiosity, asking good questions, being uncomfortable with ambiguity, and engaging lots of different people from diverse backgrounds is how I try and apply kind of what I do in the business world and what I do in my personal life.
What a remarkable childhood. I would have loved to have been a guest at your dinner table and hear those stories. And what an incredible education that transfers to who you are today and helping executives around the globe tackle human capital. So let's go there. Tell us more about what is voice and choice. Unpack that quote we kind of talked about at the beginning.
Yeah, so the context around that is through the pandemic, there's been so much telling. There's been so much telling around vaccines and return to office and mask wearing. And should we be going out and congregating together? Should we be traveling? People in workplaces and society want a voice. They want to actually be able to share how they feel around some of these social issues that are deeply personal to them. Doesn't mean that they want to change your opinion and want to debate, but they want to be heard. And they want a choice, and a choice whether it's how they work, where they work, with whom they work. We've seen that in the Great Resignation. That choice has been exercised by people voting with their feet. But that choice also bleeds into return to office, which we know, sadly, is a crazily polarizing topic around the developed world and around those people who have the choice of working from home. If only we could just kind of think about voice and choice in a different way, kind of as business leaders. So I'm sure we'll get into some of that, but that's really where it came from.
I value that you're bringing this forward with such authenticity and transparency because there is that divide. And we also have this increase in it. I remember when Facebook started coming out, I was working in higher education at the time, and we talked about what is it going to be as people have been very co-creative and out there almost as digital citizens voicing their opinion. And now we're almost 20 years later, seeing it bleed into the workforce of where they don't see that divide as it used to be for others. So what is a C-suite executive supposed to do as they think about strategies that they can employ to really address voice and choice and be competitive for human capital?
Yeah, so if we stick with the voice piece, in our global survey, 52,000 employees, 44 different countries, all different worker types and income levels and backgrounds. 2/3 of them said they're having discussions on these social issues in the workplace. They could be issues that are relevant to them: immigration, gun safety, LGBT, whatever it is that's relevant to them. And by and large, they're having a positive experience. Younger people, the Generation Z, were having a more positive experience because they were feeling heard. And so we didn't need a pandemic to tell us that when people are distracted by things externally, they bring them to work and they do affect their engagement, their ability to be creative, their ability to be productive. So businesses have a choice and leaders have a choice to say, do we need to check in with people and at least acknowledge factors that may be impacting them? And again, and sometimes people just want to be listened to. But the pandemic has humanized work. It's humanized the concept of leadership and kind of working with colleagues. And people are open to showing more emotions. So I know some business leaders might be listening to this and saying, really, I'm not really trained for this. I don't know how to have these discussions. But by and large, we're seeing that workforces want this because it does drive back to productivity and whatever you're working on. And so it's really important to understand some of those factors. And again, this is not to be conflated with the positions that a company takes. A company may take a position on a social issue, or it may choose to not. But either way, your employees are talking about these topics. So you have a choice to engage and put some guardrails around that to enhance kind of what's right for your business and your people.
And dialogue and debate is good. I think that's a piece that as CEOs and executives navigate this space, the space for conversation and debate, or the space to model. If we may not agree, how do we move forward on common ground? And I think we're going to have to work as a community and as an executive team to understand common ground is really hard in our current environment. And finding spaces where there can be common ground is going to be critical. I also love that the pandemic unlocked for some executives. They were doing more virtual listening to employees, and we've seen few companies continue that in the market because it kept a pulse of open dialogue that closed that divide that you so richly talked about.
One of the things we're working with many clients on, Mandy, is how to equip managers with some of these new skills that you need in this environment. Leaders do need a new map. We haven't been so personalized. We haven't worked in a hybrid environment. We haven't had to deal with this level of transparency and change for a significant period of time. And as you know, many managers today haven't lived through economic recessions or even high inflation. So we're seeing an acknowledgement that managers need different skills. And we see a lot of companies now investing in building those skills and kind of humanizing the concept of leadership that we talked about earlier.
Bhushan, as they try to deal with this labor market paradox, how can the C-suite have one practical step forward, thinking into 2023? We're closing out the year, they're looking ahead. What can they do next?
Yeah, as leaders, think about this paradox of I need to continue to attract and retain specialist talent to grow and transform my business. And I need to manage costs in a humane way. And that might mean layoffs, but I've got to be super transparent. And I've got to make sure that I'm doing everything I can to be able to offer upskilling opportunities and other job opportunities, maybe with some of my business partners. There's a need for leaders to step up and be transparent and say, this is how we're making decisions. We don't have all the answers, but we will engage you in that process. And we've seen lessons learned from the 80s, from the 2008 financial crisis, from the dot-com bubble bursting in '02, where many firms and many leaders didn't actually do that. And it's actually given them scar tissue, and it's given kind of reputational damage for years to come for many of those businesses and those leaders.
I appreciate that you unpacked the lessons learned, because we all, through any form of crisis that you mentioned, get some things wrong, get some things right. And now is the time for executives, as they tackle human capital, to evolve. As we move into regulation space, the SEC is weighing in on human capital disclosure, which is highly interesting to see. It's been around since 2020. Now there's some refinement happening in the market. What should companies who are heading in the right direction, the companies that you see as regulation is forming on this topic, what are they doing?
So independent of regulation, I think it's important to say that certain companies are taking positions on their disclosures on topics, whether it be gender representation, what they're doing around minimum wages, what they're doing around physical safety, what they're doing around mental health for their people. These are all super important topics. Firms are taking the lead on this. Some are not waiting for regulation. And obviously, we've seen regulation around certain things around gender pay gap, representation data, and we're likely to see more. But transparency is so important to consumers, to workers, to suppliers, to investors, that we see more organizations needing to lean in. even if the data isn't telling a good story, Mandy, even if you're not there in terms of female representation in your executive ranks, or even if you're not there in terms of creating economic opportunities from people from kind of different backgrounds, by just disclosing this and baselining it, it earns you a huge trust dividend with your stakeholders. And then you can talk about what are the actions we can actually take to get there. And so when a lot of people kind of talk to me about kind of diversity of equity and inclusion and should we be sharing bad news, I actually lean in and say, yes, it actually wins you a lot of trust with your stakeholder groups.
I value that you went there because what we find is, let's say an investor is your key stakeholder. We talked about a CEFPRO survey early on around what are investors looking for. And they feel right now that everything is really boilerplate. And so I tell people the best thing you can do in your transparency journey is to tell people where you've been, where you are, and where you're going. Because if you don't tell them where you're going, it almost looks like, okay, well, what's the plan, right? So you've got to look there with forward-looking statements, work that through with your legal and your finance team, and come together around those issues. I think the other part about the revelation, I would love your take on this, is we have to move beyond the easy grab data to the data that drives decision usefulness. So, what is it that can help an executive team or an investor see the future? And so it's like, I say causation and correlation kind of data, right? Data that actually isn't just, okay, well, we trained X number of employees. Well, that's great. If you trained that employee, let's say in belonging or inclusive leadership practices, what happens? What happens to that team? Did they change recruiting practices? What actually moved the needle? If you're recruiting from universities and building your pipeline, what has that done to your business? And where is that going to take your business in the future? What's your take on that? Are we going to see more strong decision useful data out in the market, or are people just going to go for the easy grabs?
So I love your point around it needs to be outcomes based. And it's not just have I trained people, but have I trained people to really think about when they're creating new products, are there externalities around those products? If I'm in the tech sector, are there going to be adverse impacts of this on certain user groups? And am I going to plan for that? As I think about safety in the auto industry, am I trying to create more manufacturing kind of throughput, or am I actually thinking about passenger safety and quality? The balanced scorecard is something that we still talk about with organizations, but whether we like it or not, and many people on this call will agree with stakeholder capitalism, we are still focused on revenue and margins and profitability and cost. And in the economic downturns that we're in right now and will continue to be in, we're still going to focus on those things. But the more we can actually push to say, what is that doing around customer trust or customer harm or customer quality or supplier fairness or everything that we think about in terms of employees' well-being, training, etc., the more that we can draw the linkage between those decisions around revenue today, cost savings, profitability. Maybe we do need to trade some profitability for trust with our customers. And as people think about difficult decisions, about layoffs, about do we trade capital and technology for labor, during a recession? Do we change our footprint? Do we stop producing certain products? Do we stop serving certain customers? Pushing decisions to say, let's think about long-term trust and quality and implications of that. And even layoffs. People have long memories that can have big scar tissue on communities. Just getting more of that discussion in the board and management room will be highly effective.
I appreciate that tip and that advice. And I think we've had some shows with Peter Land from Dick's Sporting Goods talking about brands taking a stand, right? A really good example of a risk, an opportunity, and a cost when they chose to value the lives of a human being and remove assault weapons from their shelves. It's a cost and it's a decision of the long-term impact. Or Beth Wood from Principal Financial Group uncovering how data-driven decisions with research around financial security and their ESG superpower, what does that look like when government, education, and business come together to drive the future of different markets around the world? So everyone is closing out this year, right? The COP is in the middle of play, and in November, we've got human capital regulation coming, potential of climate. And they're saying, how do I close out the year strong? And what do I need to focus on in 2023? So, what would be your tip, your key, your advice to this group thinking about human capital in their boardroom for 2023?
So the first piece of advice, and I'd add a couple of other factors there, we're still dealing with a terrible war, which is impacting much of Europe and the developing world because of kind of the knock-on impacts there, rampant inflation and interest rates. We've got geopolitical tensions around the world. What leaders can do right now is get out there and communicate with transparency. You mentioned some great examples of courageous leaders who actually forewent the short-term profit for longer-term trust. The more businesses can work with their stakeholder groups to say, how do we scenario plan these impacts and how do we think about these decisions we need to make? And let's bring people in and be transparent. If we want to be transparent around what we're doing around our carbon footprint or what we're doing around the community, are we trying to protect people by upskilling them, even if we have to make a difficult decision to lay them off because that's better for the community. And for some businesses, those employees also may be customers. And so I just think that getting out there and being super transparent, taking a risk, people will not kind of punish you for being overly transparent. Those businesses that are going to not be transparent, or at least, or you hear about it through other means on social media, I mean, that's where you break trust. So again, it can sound very intangible, but trust is one of the dividends that businesses has. It has more trust than politicians. It has more trust than mainstream media. And so those businesses and those leaders that have got a trust dividend coming out of the pandemic, they keep that through better transparency around all difficult decisions that impact your business and your people.
I appreciate that tip and landing on the dividend of trust, and how you gain trust is through transparency and that open and honest dialogue, as we talked about, navigating the voice and choice. And it may not be perfect, but we can always move towards progress together. Thank you so much, Bhushan Sethi, for joining us. It has been a valuable discussion, and we look forward to helping our executives as they close out the year and tackle 2023 with finesse. We'll talk real soon.